Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're plunging into a topic that's, well, as ancient as civilization itself, yet shockingly present in our world today.
Human enslavement.
Exactly. It's a long, complex, and frankly, deeply troubling history. This is heavy stuff, no doubt about it.
It really is.
But understanding it is absolutely essential, isn't it? To grasp how exploitation has been woven into the fabric of human society across millennia, across continents.
Yeah, it's fundamental.
So we're taking the sources you've shared, a rich historical overview, and some crucial data on contemporary forms. And our mission today is to, cut through the density.
Unpack it.
Yeah, unpack it, extract the most important nuggets, connect the past to the present, and hopefully spark some real understanding. Maybe even a few challenging aha moments amidst the tough realities.
Definitely.
Did you know, for instance, that the latest estimates, I think from 2021, put the number of people in modern slavery globally at nearly 50 million?
50 million. It's staggering.
That number alone is just a stark reminder. This isn't just history, it's a current crisis. Understanding its roots is vital.
Absolutely critical. And what's truly striking when you look across these sources is how this practice, in countless different guises, has persisted.
Right.
It's not an isolated event in one time or place. It's this recurring pattern of power taking advantage of vulnerability.
And constantly adapting its methods as laws and societies change.
Exactly.
So we're going to trace this arc, starting way back in ancient times, moving through the horrific transatlantic trade, looking at what happened after legal abolition, and finally, diving deep into what modern slavery looks like today, and the fight against it, of course.
Sounds like a plan. A heavy one, but necessary.
Okay, let's kick things off then. The sources make it incredibly clear that slavery isn't some recent invention. It's foundational to many of the very first organized human societies we know about.
Absolutely foundational. Think about Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization, right? From the earliest city-states like Sumer through Babylon, Assyria, systems of slavery were just, standard.
And where did these enslaved people come from?
Various sources. War captives were a major one, but people also fell into slavery through debt, crime, or just being born to enslaved parents.
And they were seen as property?
Unequivocally. Bought, sold, even branded.
Branded. Wow, that really drives home the property aspect.
It does. And the Code of Hammurabi, one of the earliest legal codes we have, shows just how integrated it was.
How so?
It includes specific laws dealing with enslaved people, even outlines really harsh penalties. For instance, harboring a runaway slave, death penalty if they belong to the palace.
Death, just for helping someone escape.
Yes, and for an enslaved person who dared to deny their master's ownership, the punishment was brutal, having an ear cut off.
Cutting off an ear just for questioning their status, that's a chilling detail about the absolute power masters held.
It is. Complete control.
And Egypt had systems too, right? But it sounds maybe a bit more varied than just simple chattel slavery.
It was quite complex, yeah. They had this term beak, often translated as worker or servant, generally seen as property valued for their utility.
So still property, but maybe focused on their work function.
Kind of. Chattel slavery definitely existed, though, largely from war captives, they called them esquirie, or living prisoners.
Living prisoners.
Yeah. Considered a resource of the pharaoh, used in state labor, given as gifts. But Egyptians could also enter bonded labor.
How did that work? Selling themselves.
Essentially, yeah. Selling themselves or family members into servitude to pay off debts. The sources even mention symbols, like a taming stick, sometimes used as markers in these transactions.
A taming stick. Wow, okay, what about the pyramids? We always hear they were built by slaves. Is that backed up?
That's actually a really common misconception.
Oh, okay.
And the sources and archaeological evidence, they pretty much push back on it. Egyptologists generally agree the Great Pyramids were built by paid, skilled laborers.
Paid laborers, not slaves.
Right. Many were likely farmers, called up for state duty during the Nile's flood season when they couldn't farm. It was more like corvée labor.
Corvée labor, like forced public service.
Exactly. Forced labor for state projects, building, mining, military support. But crucially, they were paid a wage.
Oh.
And they weren't owned by individuals. It was a duty to the state, not ownership by another person. So distinct from chattel slavery.
So even way back then, slavery wasn't just one monolithic thing. Different kinds of forced labor, servitude.
Precisely. Tied into state power, warfare, the need for labor, especially for big projects in agriculture, it drove different forms of coercion.
And warfare was a constant source of captives.
A constant source. The Egyptian example shows this mixed chattel, bonded, corvée labor, all existing in one society. Exploitation took multiple paths.
That's really interesting how these different forms coexisted. Okay, let's jump forward a bit. Classical Greece and Rome, slavery became even more central there, didn't it?
Massively central, hugely important to their society and economy. In classical Athens, for example, chattel slavery was widespread and brutal.
Douloi, they called them.
Yes, douloi, considered property, subject to violence, exploitation. Estimates suggest maybe a quarter of the population were enslaved.
A quarter. Wow. And who were they?
Primarily non-citizen foreigners, acquired through war or trade, and their status was inherited.
And they weren't just doing hard labor. The sources suggest more.
Oh, far from it. Yes, many worked in agriculture or those incredibly dangerous silver mines at Lorient.
Yeah, I read about Lorient. Grim.
Very grim. But enslaved people in Athens also worked in craftsmanship, banking, domestic service, even as artists or educators.
So a wide range of roles.
A very wide range.
Yeah.
And the sources suggest Athenian slavery, while still utterly lacking freedom, might have offered slightly more opportunities for some skilled individuals, maybe earning income, even potentially buying their freedom eventually, compared to other systems maybe.
That sounds incredibly different from Sparta's system, the Helots.
Drastically different. Sparta's system relied almost entirely on the Helots. They were the indigenous population the Spartans had subjugated.
So not foreigners captured in war.
No, the people who lived there originally. They were state-owned, hereditary serfs, bound to the land. They were the agricultural backbone supporting the Spartan citizens and their military lifestyle.
And their treatment.
Notoriously harsh. The sources describe things like the Crypteia, where young Spartans would essentially hunt and kill Helots as part of their training.
Hunt them.
Yeah, and Spartans even had an annual declaration of war against the Helots.
A declaration of war on their own labor force.
Legally permitting killing them. And they forced them to wear distinctive clothing, like dogskin caps, as markers of their status. It was about constant control through fear and brutality.
An annual declaration of war, that's just an incredible detail. Really highlights the level of fear and control needed.
It really underscores the difference. Athenian slavery, diverse, foreign chattel, some limited mobility, part of a democratic trade-based society. Spartan helotry, homogeneous, indigenous, hereditary, underpinning a militaristic oligarchy, maintained by extreme repression due to the constant risk of revolt.
And the Greeks even tried to justify this philosophically. Aristotle.
Yes, Aristotle famously argued that some people were natural slaves.
Natural slaves.
Supposedly lacking full reason, thus best suited as living tools in a supposedly mutually beneficial arrangement with masters.
Mutually beneficial.
Well, that was the argument.
Yeah.
He distinguished this from those enslaved by circumstance, legal slaves. But it shows this intellectual effort to rationalize slavery, to make it fit their worldview.
An attempt to integrate an economic reality. Okay, what about Rome? Slavery was absolutely massive there, right? Took it to another level.
To an even greater scale, yeah. Utterly fundamental to Roman society and economy. Under Roman law, enslaved people were res.
Res, meaning thing.
Exactly. Property. They explicitly lacked persona, legal personhood.
No legal rights at all.
No independent rights, couldn't enter contracts, no legal marriage. Subject to the master's absolute power vitae nescisque potestas.
The power of life and death.
Complete power.
Absolute legal powerlessness. Where did Rome get so many enslaved people?
Various sources again. War captives were a primary influx, especially as Rome expanded, but also birth burnae, children born to enslaved women, piracy, child abandonment, sometimes criminal punishment. Self-sale was limited, but possible.
And importantly, it wasn't based on race or ethnicity?
No, not primarily. It encompassed people from all across their vast empire. Roman jurists even discussed it as senius gentium, the law of nations. They acknowledged it was a universal practice, even if some felt it was, contrary to nature.
And like Athens, Roman enslaved people performed a huge range of roles, not just manual labor.
A truly astonishing range. Yes, they did the brutal, unskilled labor on the latifundia, the huge agricultural estates, in mines, mills, but they were also highly skilled artisans, chefs, domestic staff managing complex households, accountants, educators, even physicians and civil servants. Public slaves worked on state projects.
So integrated into pretty much every aspect of Roman life.
Virtually every aspect.
But a defining feature of Roman slavery, the sources stress, was the potential for manumission, being freed.
That's a crucial distinction, yes. Manumission was relatively common.
How did that happen?
Through formal legal methods, like a declaration before a magistrate, to victa, or specified in a will, casimento. or informally.
And freed persons, libertinas, they often gained citizenship.
Yes, often gained Roman citizenship and formed a significant social class. Some achieved considerable wealth.
So that prospect of freedom, it served a purpose.
It could act as an incentive for hard work, loyalty. It's this paradox. Absolute legal subjection coexisting with a structured path to upward mobility for some. Arguably, it helped to maintain the system's stability by offering hope, however limited. Imperial-era laws offered some minor protections, but enforcement was weak because they lacked legal standing.
Okay, so pulling these ancient examples together,
Right.
we see common threads, right?
Definitely.
How people became enslaved.
Uh-huh.
War, birth, debt, crime, abandonment.
The primary routes, yeah.
The diverse work they did, from back-breaking labor to highly skilled roles.
Huge range of functions.
And their legal status, almost universally, property, minimal rights, subject to the master's will. Laws regulated ownership, not protection.
Right. Deeply institutionalized, often justified by law or philosophy, and reinforced by othering the enslaved foreigners, outsiders, sometimes using physical markers like brands or clothing to differentiate and dehumanize.
This deep integration into society really highlights how monumental the later shift towards abolition would need to be. It wasn't just changing a practice, it was changing the foundations.
And a profound moral and societal shift was required.
Okay, let's fast forward now. The transatlantic slave trade. A global system operating on a scale previously unimaginable, utterly brutal, transformative.
It really was a system that fundamentally reshaped 3 continents. From roughly the 16th to the 19th centuries, it forcibly transported millions of Africans across the Atlantic.
Primarily to fuel what?
Primarily to fuel the growth of plantation economies in the Americas.
What were the core economic drivers behind this massive, brutal system?
The engine was pretty simple, really. An insatiable demand for labor in the New World.
For specific crops.
Yes, cash crops. Sugar, cotton, tobacco, coffee, indigo. Indigenous populations had been decimated by disease and warfare, and European indentured labor just wasn't enough or wasn't suitable for the scale and conditions of tropical plantation work.
So African labor became the tragic solution for European colonial powers seeking profit.
Exactly. It became the cornerstone for maximizing profit in these colonial ventures.
And the profitability was it? It's immense.
It generated vast wealth for European nations, ship owners, merchants, bankers, planters. It contributed significantly to the capital that fueled European industrialization and colonial expansion.
Huge returns, despite the risks.
Substantial returns, yes, which created this powerful economic incentive to keep the trade going. Mechanisms like the Spanish Asiento de Negros, that monopoly contract to supply enslaved Africans, later held by the British and chartered companies like the English Royal African Company, were key instruments.
These were massive state-sanctioned operations.
Absolutely.
Deeply institutionalized.
The sources even point out links to new technologies like the cotton gin, accelerating things.
Yeah, Eli Whitney's cotton gin in 1793. It made processing short-staple cotton viable, leading to an explosion in cotton cultivation in the U.S. South.
Which
directly fueled an increased demand for enslaved labor, ironically, just as abolitionist sentiment was beginning to grow elsewhere.
Wow. And the triangular trade model helps visualize this.
It's a simplified model, but useful.
Okay.
Leg 1. European ships with manufactured goods, textiles, firearms, alcohol head to West Africa.
Leg 2, the Middle Passage. Exchange those goods for enslaved Africans. Here, African traders, rulers, merchants, military figures played a role, capturing people through warfare, kidnapping, or for debt or punishment. Powerful kingdoms like Dahomey were involved. Europeans operated from forts and trading posts like Elmina or Gorée, sometimes direct raids too. Then the horrific journey across the Atlantic.
In Leg 3.
The ships arrive in the Americas, disembark the survivors, load up on plantation products, sugar, cotton, molasses, rum, and head back to Europe.
Creating this interconnected economic web, which nations were the main players?
Portugal were pioneers, especially for Brazil. Britain became dominant by the 18th century. Liverpool was a major hub. France, Spain, often relying on the Asiento. The Netherlands, Denmark, even Sweden and the U.S. were involved.
States, companies, individuals, all profiting.
Yes, prominent families, financiers, merchants, ship captains. It highlights how deeply embedded this was in the economic and social structure, explaining the fierce resistance to abolition later on.
So this was truly an early, brutal form of globalized capitalism, built on the systematic dehumanization of millions.
That's precisely it. It wasn't just trade. It was a system built on stripping people of their humanity for profit.
Let's talk about that middle leg, the middle passage, the human cost. It's almost impossible to fully grasp.
It is a human catastrophe on an unimaginable scale. Estimates suggest somewhere between, say, 12.5 and 15 million Africans were forcibly abducted between 1501 and 1867.
One of the largest forced migrations in
It's the
history.
very largest.
And the voyage itself.
Yeah.
The sources describe sheer horror.
Deliberate horror, designed solely for profit. Ships were packed to maximize numbers, tight packing, people chained together, cramped, unsanitary conditions below deck for weeks, sometimes months.
Disease must have been rampant.
Rampant. Dysentery, smallpox, scurvy. The mortality rate on the crossing was horrific, often 10–20%, sometimes much higher per voyage. Millions died before even reaching the America's forced marches, coastal dungeons called barracoons, or during the transit.
And the psychological trauma, the abuse.
Unimaginable. Physical and sexual abuse by the crew was common. It was all part of a process intended to break people, to dehumanize them, to season them for the brutality of plantation life.
And then arrival wasn't the end of the trauma.
No. Arrival meant the trauma of sale. Auctions, where people were inspected like livestock, families deliberately torn apart, or the scramble buyers rushing in to grab people. Then often further journeys inland to plantations or mines.
The impact in Africa must have been devastating, too.
Devastating. Destabilized societies, loss of productive people, fueling internal conflict, and the legacy in the Americas. Profound intergenerational trauma, the creation of rigid racial hierarchies, cultural loss, systemic discrimination that, continues today.
The scale and the system are just overwhelming. But eventually, this horrific system faced growing opposition. The path to abolition wasn't quick or easy, though.
No, it was a protracted struggle, spanning over a century. Driven by a confluence of forces, new ideas, resistance from the enslaved themselves, and shifting political and economic landscapes.
What were some of the key ideas driving it?
A major catalyst was the Enlightenment. Thinkers promoting reason, liberty, natural rights, universal human equality.
Ideas fundamentally at odds with slavery.
Exactly. Philosophically incompatible. This intellectual shift was paired with powerful religious imperative.
Religious groups got involved.
Yes, many religious groups, particularly Quakers, began viewing slavery as a profound sin against God, violating principles of kindness, equality in God's eyes. Quakers were real pioneers here.
How so?
They issued the first organized condemnations, prohibited members from owning slaves, formed some of the earliest abolitionist societies. Later, the Catholic Church issued condemnations too.
So Enlightenment reason met religious morality.
And humanitarian arguments gained traction too. As more became known about the horrors of the Middle Passage, plantation life there was a growing moral outcry.
Making the abstract real.
Exactly. Personal narratives from formerly enslaved individuals, like Frederick Douglass, were incredibly powerful. And literature, like Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, they turned the abstract issue into a visceral human tragedy, mobilizing public opinion through moral suasion.
This combination, Enlightenment, religion, humanitarianism, created a potent force. Who were some key figures leading the charge? What were their strategies?
In Britain, William Wilberforce was a key parliamentary leader, working tirelessly with activists like Thomas Clarkson. They used moral and religious arguments, but also economic ones.
Economic arguments against slavery.
Yeah, drawing on thinkers like Adam Smith, arguing slave labor was inefficient, that free labor or trade elsewhere could be more profitable as industry grew less dependent on the slave trade itself.
So appealing to both conscience and wallet.
Kind of. In the U.S., you had towering figures like Frederick Douglass.
Escaped slavery himself.
Yes, used his incredible oratory and writing. His newspaper, the North Star, advocated political action, supported the Union. Then there was William Lloyd Garrison, a radical white abolitionist.
The liberator.
Right. Demanded immediate emancipation, famously burned the Constitution in protest. The Grimke sisters, Sarah and Angelina.
From the South, right. Quakers.
Yes, Southern Quakers who used their firsthand knowledge to speak out and, importantly, linked the fight for abolition to the emerging struggle for women's rights.
And figures like John Brown advocating violence.
Believed violent confrontation was necessary. Harper's Ferry. And Stowe's novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin, had an immense emotional impact, galvanizing anti-slavery sentiment, especially in the North.
It sounds like a movement with a really wide range of tactics.
A whole spectrum. Moral suasion media, speeches, narratives, organizing abolitionist societies, mass petition campaigns, lobbying, political action, new parties, supporting candidates, direct action and resistance, the Underground Railroad, which Douglass's home was part of, and armed resistance like Brown's. Visual propaganda, too.
But not monolithic. Lots of debate within the movement.
Definitely not monolithic. Constant debates about strategy, pace, the role of violence,
Hmm.
and that clear intersectionality with women's rights through figures like the Grimkes and Lucretia Mott.
And we absolutely cannot talk about abolition without highlighting the crucial role of resistance by enslaved people themselves. It wasn't just something done to them.
Absolutely essential, and often underacknowledged in older histories. Enslaved people were not passive victims. They resisted constantly.
How?
Everyday acts, sabotage, slowing down work, non-cooperation, running away, and, crucially, organized rebellions. These acts directly challenged the stability and profitability of the slave system.
The Haitian Revolution being the most dramatic example.
The most successful, certainly. Starting in 1791, the only large-scale slave revolt in history that led to an independent nation free from slavery, ruled by formerly enslaved people. It sent shockwaves of fear through slaveholding societies everywhere.
And there were others.
Yes. In the U.S., revolts like Gabriel Prosser's in 1800, Nat Turner's in 1831, brutally suppressed, but they intensified slaveholders' fears and fueled the debate. In the British Caribbean, major revolts in Barbados, Demerara, and especially the Baptist War in Jamaica in 1831-32 were incredibly impactful.
There's been some debate, hasn't there, about whether these rebellions actually helped or hindered the cause of abolition.
Yes, for a long time the argument was they just scared slaveholders, made them dig in their heels, maybe slowed things down.
But newer scholarship suggests otherwise.
Exactly. More recent scholarship, like the work mentioned in the sources, argues persuasively that these revolts, particularly in the British Caribbean, actually accelerated the pace of abolition.
How did that work? How did revolts speed things up?
Abolitionists, especially in Britain, began using these revolts as powerful evidence. Evidence of the inherent injustice, yes, but also the instability of slavery.
Ah, a practical argument.
Right. They argued emancipation wasn't just moral, it was necessary to prevent larger, bloodier conflicts. They constantly invoke Haiti. This helped push the movement towards demanding immediate rather than gradual emancipation.
So it reframed the issue not just wrong, but dangerous and unsustainable.
Precisely. And these revolts had a tangible economic impact too.
How so? Property damage.
Significant property destruction disrupted production, forced governments to spend heavily on security and suppression. This increased the costs and risks of maintaining slavery. It reduced the value of slave property, especially in places like Jamaica after the Baptist War.
Making compensation seem like a better option.
Exactly. This economic pressure made the idea of compensating owners for emancipation, which the British government eventually did, more palatable than facing continued instability and financial losses. It shifted parliamentary support.
So it sounds like resistance wasn't just a backdrop, it was an active driving force, demonstrating agency, challenging the system.
Absolutely. Creating the conditions, forcing the issue, helping make legal emancipation possible. It was a catalyst.
This long struggle eventually led to legal abolition, but as you said, it was a gradual, uneven global process. Took over a century, really.
Very much a piecemeal process, unfolding differently everywhere. Some early moves. France in 1315 declared anyone on French soil free, but that didn't apply to colonies.
Right. Colonies were different.
Yeah. The French Revolution briefly abolished colonial slavery in 1794, but Napoleon brought it back in 1802. Wasn't final in French colonies until 1848.
And the first European colonial power to ban the trade itself?
That was Denmark-Norway in 1792, though it took effect in 1803. Britain followed soon after. The 1772 Somerset case ruled slavery had no legal basis in England itself.
But again, not the colonies initially.
Right. The big step was the Slave Trade Act of 1807, banning the trade throughout the British Empire.
Key distinction there, banning the trade, not slavery itself yet.
Precisely. Full legal abolition in most British colonies came with the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833, effective 1834.
And that freed a huge number of people.
Over 800,000, mainly in the Caribbean, South Africa, and Canada, became free territory. But, as the sources note, the British government paid massive compensation.
Not to the enslaved people.
No, to the slave owners. A huge sum, something like 40% of the national budget then.
Compensating the owners for losing their property. That really highlights the priorities even at the moment of liberation.
It's stark. And the act included an apprenticeship system that delayed full freedom for several years, meant to ease the transition for planters.
Maintain the labor force, basically.
Pretty much. In the U.S., abolition was tied directly to the Civil War. Gradual abolition started in northern states after the Revolution. The international slave trade was banned federally in 1808.
But slavery boomed in the South.
Exactly, leading to war. Key milestones: Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, a war measure freeing slaves in Confederate territory. And finally, the 13th Amendment in 1865.
Formally abolishing slavery nationwide.
Yes, formally abolished slavery and involuntary servitude, except
Ah, yes.
Yeah.
The exception.
except as a punishment for crime, wherever the party shall have been duly convicted.
That little clause would have huge consequences later.
Devastating consequences,
Yeah.
creating a loophole that would be exploited almost immediately.
And other countries took longer. Brazil was late, wasn't it?
Brazil is the last in the Americas, 1888. Russia freed its serfs in 1861. Mauritania only officially outlawed slavery in 1981, though enforcement remains a huge challenge. Japan banned chattel slavery back in 1590.
So, different paths, different timelines, shows how varied it was.
Influenced by local economies, politics, strength of pro-slavery forces, and crucially, these legal milestones, while monumental, didn't mean true freedom or equality overnight.
No, the compensation for owners, apprenticeship, that 13th Amendment loophole, they all foreshadowed new problems.
Exactly. New forms of coercion, new systems of exploitation would emerge almost immediately.
Which brings us right to that period, the aftermath of abolition. The sources make it clear. The end of legal chattel slavery did not mean the end of exploitation.
Absolutely not. The legal status changed, but the deep-seated demand for cheap labor, especially on plantations and in colonies, remained intense.
So new systems cropped up, often targeting the same people.
Yes, targeting the newly freed populations or other vulnerable groups. These alternative systems, while technically not slavery, replicated many of its exploitative conditions, often underpinned by the same old racial and social hierarchies.
I remember the sources mentioning how some white workers in the U.S. North compared their factory conditions to wage slavery, but black abolitionists pushed back hard on that.
They rejected it forcefully. Frederick Douglass and others argued passionately. Factory work might be harsh, but it was incomparable to chattel slavery. Because Northern workers, however poor, had the legal right to quit, to seek work elsewhere. That fundamental difference, not being owned property, was crucial.
A critical distinction. Okay, what about in European colonies after they abolished chattel slavery? Africa, Asia.
Colonial powers quickly implemented new forms of forced labor for state projects, for European companies. The ILO later categorized these: requisition labor for transport, prestation labor taxes for public works, conscript labor for infrastructure, penal labor, even forcing peasants to grow specific cash crops.
So, different name, similar outcome, cheap, coerced labor.
Often with little or no pay, harsh conditions, ensuring a labor source for colonial interests continued.
And the sources detail this massive system of indentured servitude, the coolie trade.
Yes, a major development, especially after British abolition in 1833. Needing new labor for plantations, particularly in the Caribbean, they turned to India and later China.
Large numbers of people.
Huge numbers, millions eventually. Recruited, often deceptively, through contracts garments for Indians to places like the Caribbean, Fiji, Mauritius, Southeast Asia, the Americas.
And the conditions for these Indian and Chinese laborers, were they better than slavery?
The voyages themselves were often perilous, high mortality rates. On arrival, plantation conditions were brutal.
Long hours, low pay.
Long hours, meager pay, severe discipline, child labor. And the contracts were often manipulated. Dishonest accounting, high interest on credit for supplies, wage deductions. People got trapped in debt.
So debt bondage, essentially.
Effectively binding them to the plantation for years beyond their original contract, even though it was a legal agreement. Recruitment brokers in China, the Kithao, were notorious for deception, coercion, even kidnapping.
So even with a contract, the reality was often forced labor due to deception, debt, power imbalance.
Exactly. It functioned as a new form of bondage, provided a workforce for colonial economies and global industries, but created new diaspora communities who often faced severe discrimination and hardship. The term coolie itself became a slur.
And back in the U.S. South after the Civil War, the end of slavery was almost immediately followed by systems designed to control and exploit formerly enslaved people.
This is where that 13th Amendment loophole, except as punishment for crime, becomes absolutely central.
How was it used?
Two main systems emerged. Sharecropping became dominant in agriculture. Landless farmers, mostly black, but also poor whites, worked a planter's land for a share of the crop.
Sounds fair on the surface.
On the surface. But landowners and merchants used inflated prices for supplies, high interest rates, dishonest accounting to keep farmers perpetually in debt.
Trapping them. Debt peonage.
Exactly, making it nearly impossible to get ahead or leave. And for Black Americans, discrimination in land ownership and credit access meant sharecropping was often the only option.
And the other system, convict leasing.
Even more brutal. Southern states passed restrictive Black codes and vagrancy laws, criminalized minor offenses like loitering, unemployment, disproportionately targeted Black men and women,
Arrested them, convicted them.
and then leased them out by the state
Right.
to private businesses, mines, timber companies, planters.
Leased convicts.
Yes. The state got revenue, the companies got exceptionally cheap, disposable labor. The convicts got no wages and faced horrific conditions, extremely high mortality rates.
The sources called it slavery by another name.
Absolutely. A blatant tool of racial control and economic exploitation, using the penal system to replicate slavery's forced labor.
And these systems were backed up politically.
Reinforced by systematic political disenfranchisement of Black Americans, poll taxes, literacy tests, violence from groups like the KKK, limited their ability to challenge these practices legally or politically, maintained white supremacy and a cheap Black labor force for generations.
It's a clear pattern, isn't it? Legal abolition closes one door, but the demand for cheap labor finds new ways, new forms of coercion, which brings us right up to the present day. We use this umbrella term, modern slavery. What exactly does that encompass now?
Right. Modern slavery, used by organizations like Anti-Slavery International, Walk Free. It's not one single legal definition, but it describes situations of exploitation.
Exploitation where someone can't leave.
Exactly. Cannot refuse or leave because of threats, violence, coercion, deception, or abuse of power. It covers things like human trafficking, forced labor, debt bondage, various forms.
But there are more specific legal definitions used internationally, right, for laws and policies.
Yes, absolutely essential for legal action. The ILO's Forced Labor Convention, way back from 1930, is key.
How does that define it?
Defines forced labor as all work or service, which is exacted from any person under the menace of any penalty, and for which the said person has not offered himself or herself voluntarily.
So the key elements are work, threat of penalty, and it being involuntary.
Precisely. Then there's the UN's Palermo Protocol from 2000, which defines human trafficking.
That's got a specific formula, doesn't it?
Yes, a three-part formula. The act like recruitment, transport, transfer. The means used force, coercion, deception, abuse of vulnerability. And the purpose, which has to be exploitation.
Exploitation-like.
Sexual exploitation, forced labor, slavery-like practices, servitude, forced criminality, even organ removal. And crucially, under Palermo, if those coercive means are used, the victim's consent is irrelevant.
Consent doesn't matter if they were tricked or forced into it. So trafficking is more about how someone gets into the exploitation, while forced labor is about the conditions of the work itself, enforced by threat.
That's a pretty good way to distinguish them, yeah. Although they very often overlap. Someone could be trafficked into a forced labor situation.
Okay. And the UN also addresses forced marriage.
Yes, specifically forced and early marriage, defined as marriage without full and free consent. And child marriage, under 18, is considered inherently forced because a child legally cannot give full consent.
So these international frameworks all really focus on exploitation and the lack of free, informed, ongoing consent.
That's the core issue running through all these definitions.
Okay, given these definitions, what are the main forms of modern slavery we actually see today?
Forced labor is the most prevalent form overall, around 27.6 million people, according to that 2021 data.
And it happens everywhere.
Pretty much any sector. Agriculture, fishing, domestic work, construction, manufacturing, services, even illicit activities. Then there's debt bondage.
That sounds like what happened with indentured servitude.
Very similar dynamic. Considered the most widespread single form globally. People forced to work to repay a debt, often manipulated, inflated, or even inherited. They lose control over their work, can't leave. Common in agriculture, brick kilns, mining, manufacturing, domestic work. Migrants are particularly vulnerable.
And human trafficking leading to those various types of exploitation we mentioned.
Yes, sexual exploitation, labor exploitation, forced crime, forced marriage, organ removal. It's the process using those means for that exploitative purpose.
What about older forms? Do they still exist?
Shockingly, yes. Descent-based slavery, hereditary slavery, people born into slave status, considered property of a master family.
Where does that still happen?
It persists in parts of the Sahel region in Africa. Mauritania, Niger, Mali are mentioned in the sources. People work without pay, can be sold or inherited, face severe abuse, denied basic rights. Even if they escape, they face huge stigma.
That sounds terrifyingly similar to ancient chattel slavery. a direct continuation.
It absolutely is in some communities. Then there's child slavery and the worst forms of child labor.
Exploiting children for gain.
Yes, through trafficking, used as child soldiers, child marriage, or hazardous work, defined by ILO Convention 182. Things like being sold, debt bondage, forced labor, prostitution, illicit activities, dangerous jobs. Nearly 1 in 10 children globally are in child labor.
1 in 10, that's huge.
It's devastating. And forced and early marriage, as we mentioned, often traps girls and women in a lifetime of servitude and exploitation.
And states themselves can be the perpetrators.
Definitely. State-imposed forced labor. Government's compelling work for economic development, political punishment, discrimination against minorities, using prison labor or military conscripts for commercial gain.
Where do we see examples of that?
Cotton production in Turkmenistan and parts of China, particularly the Xinjiang-Uyghur Autonomous Region, XUAR, manufacturing in Xinjiang.
Yeah.
Forced prison labor in various countries, exploiting conscripts.
And domestic servitude, often hidden.
Highly vulnerable, happens behind closed doors. Domestic workers, especially migrants, are often isolated, faced with withheld pay, excessive hours, restriction of movement, physical or sexual abuse. It can easily amount to forced labor or slavery-like conditions. About 1.4 million estimated in forced domestic work.
It's crucial to see how interconnected these forms often are, right? Trafficked into debt bondage, child marriage leading to servitude.
Absolutely. And how they prey on existing vulnerabilities: poverty, discrimination, conflict, unsafe migration, lack of legal status, lack of education or support networks.
Exploiters use deception, psychological coercion, not always just overt violence.
Increasingly so. Psychological coercion, deception, manipulating debt, abusing vulnerability are powerful tools alongside physical threats. And because so much is hidden or woven into complex global supply chains, it's incredibly difficult to detect and combat.
Okay, let's look at the global scale again. Using that 2021 data, nearly 50 million people. That number is just hard to comprehend.
It is staggering.
Yeah.
And as you said, sadly, it's a significant increase, about 10 million more people since the previous estimates in 2016.
Why the increase?
It's linked to converging global crises. The impacts of conflict, climate change driving displacement, the COVID-19 pandemic, disrupting economies and support systems, rising poverty, increased unsafe migration. All these create more vulnerability.
Are there specific groups who are more affected demographics?
Very much so. Women and girls are significantly overrepresented, well over half of all victims.
In specific forms.
They account for 99% of victims in commercial sexual exploitation, 58% in other forms of forced labor, and they're overwhelmingly affected by forced marriage. About 4 out of 5 people in forced marriage are women or girls.
And children. You mentioned the high numbers earlier.
Horrifically impacted.
Okay.
More than 12 million children, about 1 in 4 victims overall. Over half the children in forced labor are in commercial sexual exploitation. And around 2 out of 5 people in forced marriage were children when they were married.
Just devastating. And migrant workers, too.
Extremely vulnerable. The data shows migrants are 3 times more likely to be in forced labor than non-migrant adults because of legal precarity, debt from recruitment fees, language barriers, dependence on employers, all sorts of factors.
Where is this most prevalent geographically? Looking at the rate victims per 1,000 people.
The Arab states have the highest prevalence rate overall, according to the 2021 estimates. Also the highest rates for both forced labor and forced marriage specifically.
Okay, who's next?
Europe and Central Asia are second highest overall and second highest for forced labor. Asia and the Pacific are third overall but have a high rate of forced marriage. Africa actually has the lowest reported forced labor prevalence rate but very high rates of child marriage, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa.
Yeah.
The Americas have the lowest rate of forced marriage.
But prevalence rate isn't the whole story, right? Absolute numbers paint a different picture.
Exactly. In terms of the sheer number of people enslaved, Asia and the Pacific accounts for over half the global total, around 29.3 million people.
Wow, over half.
Yeah. And the highest absolute numbers in forced labor, too, about 15.1 million. Europe and Central Asia have the second highest absolute numbers in forced labor, around 4.1 million.
And this isn't just happening in poor countries, right? The data showed.
That's a really important point. Over half of all forced labor and a quarter of forced marriages occur in upper middle income or high income countries. It's not just a developing world problem.
The Walk-Free Global Slavery Index from 2023, it listed countries with the highest prevalence rates, often linked to state action or conflict.
Yes, countries like North Korea, Eritrea, Mauritania, places known for state-imposed labor or descent-based slavery. Also Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Tajikistan, UAE, Russia, Afghanistan, Kuwait, often linked to conflict, weak governance, or exploitation of migrant workers.
But then looking at countries with the largest absolute numbers of people, that list includes some major economies.
It does. India has the largest estimated number, 11 million, followed by China at 5.8 million. Others with huge numbers include North Korea, Pakistan, Russia, Indonesia, Nigeria, Turkey, and significantly the United States.
The U.S., how many?
Estimated 1.1 million people in modern slavery in the U.S. This data shows 6 G20 nations, major global economies, are among the countries with the largest absolute numbers.
That really brings it home, doesn't it? Major economies, significant numbers, and those economies are importing goods potentially made with forced labor.
Absolutely. The G20 nations collectively account for over half of all people estimated to be in modern slavery, and they import an estimated $468 billion worth of products annually that are at risk of being produced with forced labor.
$468 billion.
And the United States is the largest single importer of these at-risk goods. The illegal profits generated by forced labor globally, ILO estimates a staggering $236 billion per year. Highest profit per victim is in commercial sexual exploitation.
Those figures really underscore how deeply this is intertwined with global supply chains, the global economy, and potentially the products we all consume.
It's undeniable. The demand for cheap goods and services drives exploitation down the chain.
So, what is being done to fight back against this? It feels like such a massive, deeply ingrained challenge. Where do you even start?
It is formidable, but there are significant efforts underway. It's complex, multi-layered, involving international bodies, governments, NGOs, civil society, and increasingly, businesses.
What's the foundation? International law.
The international legal framework provides a base. Those UN slavery conventions, the Palermo Protocol on trafficking, the ILO's conventions on forced labor, including the newer protocol PIA 029 from 2014, which strengthens prevention, protection, and remedy, and explicitly links to trafficking.
The big organizations, ILO, IOM, UNODC, what's their role?
They're crucial. The ILO sets labor standards, monitors compliance, provides vital research and data, like those global estimates we discussed. IOM focuses on migration, collecting data on trafficking, assisting victims. UNODC is the custodian of the Palermo Protocol, helps governments with law enforcement and justice responses, does research. OHCHR, the UN Human Rights Office, pushes a human rights-based approach, focusing on victim protection and root causes.
And there's a specific UN goal.
Yes, UN Sustainable Development Goal, Target 8.7, explicitly calls for eradicating forced labor, modern slavery, trafficking, and the worst forms of child labor by 2030. Alliance 8.7 is the global partnership trying to coordinate action towards that goal.
Lots of frameworks and goals. What about national efforts where the enforcement actually happens?
Governments bear the primary responsibility, absolutely. Many countries have passed specific anti-trafficking or modern slavery legislation. The U.S. has the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, the TVPA, since 2000.
Based on the 3 Ps.
Right. Prevention, protection, including specialty visas for victims and prosecution. And the U.S. State Department produces that annual Trafficking in Persons, or TIP report, grading countries on their efforts.
And the UK has its Modern Slavery Act.
Yes, from 2015. Created new criminal offenses, provisions for victim support, and importantly, Section 54, requiring large businesses to report on steps they're taking to prevent slavery in their supply chains.
Has that been effective?
It's faced criticism. Some say it's too voluntary, lacks strong enforcement, maybe focuses too much on victims after the fact rather than prevention. More recently, a very significant U.S. law is the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, UFLPA.
Targeting goods from Xinjiang.
Exactly, from 2021. It creates a powerful legal presumption, a rebuttable presumption, that goods made wholly or in part in Xinjiang are made with forced labor. Imports are banned unless companies can provide clear and convincing evidence otherwise.
That sounds like it puts the burden of proof squarely on the companies.
It does. It's had a notable impact on forcing companies to conduct much deeper due diligence on their supply chains connected to that region.
So legislation, law enforcement units, training, awareness campaigns, victim support like shelters, aid, counseling, these are the national tools.
Those are the main tools. But challenges remain everywhere. Limited resources, corruption, the sheer complexity of investigating these hidden, often transnational crimes.
NGOs and civil society groups seem absolutely vital in this fight, filling gaps governments miss.
Indispensable. They play multiple critical roles. They're powerful advocates and campaigners, pushing for stronger laws, demanding corporate accountability groups like Anti-Slavery International, Walk Free, the Core Coalition.
They do research too.
Vital research and awareness raising. exposing the issue, identifying risks, publishing reports like the Global Slavery Index. They provide direct support and assistance to survivors. Organizations like Unseen UK or International Justice Mission do crucial work on the ground. And they monitor government and corporate compliance. Think of the Cotton Campaign focused on Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan.
So they push from the outside and help on the inside.
Exactly. They often act as a critical friend to businesses trying to improve, while also campaigning hard for mandatory legal standards when voluntary measures clearly aren't enough.
And businesses themselves, they're facing increasing pressure and responsibility.
Definitely. Driven by legislation like the UK Act or UFLPA, by reputational risk, investor pressure, consumer awareness. There's much more focus now on corporate social responsibility, CSR, codes of conduct, ethical sourcing policies.
What about seeing into those complex supply chains?
That's the big challenge. There's a major push towards greater supply chain transparency, mapping suppliers, identifying risks. But voluntary efforts often fall short. That's why there are growing calls globally for mandatory human rights due diligence legislation, making companies legally responsible for preventing abuses in their value chains.
So, moving beyond just reporting to actual accountability.
That's the goal. Many companies are also joining multi-stakeholder initiatives to develop industry standards and share best practices, like Stronger Together or the Fair Labor Association. But the challenge remains huge, ensuring genuine accountability across incredibly complex, often opaque global supply chains, especially when there's constant pressure to cut costs.
So despite all these efforts, international frameworks, national laws, NGO work, business initiatives, it's clearly still a massive ongoing battle.
A very challenging, ongoing battle, absolutely. The sheer scale of the problem, the persistent drivers like poverty and inequality, the constant demand for cheap labor and goods, and the adaptability of exploiters mean vigilance and concerted action across all these sectors are constantly needed. It's not something that gets solved easily.
This deep dive has really driven home that human enslavement isn't just some dark chapter buried in history books. It's this ancient practice that has sadly mutated, adapted, and persisted into complex, often hidden forms right now, today.
That's the crucial takeaway.
Legal abolition was monumental, yes, but clearly not an endpoint. The reality of nearly 50 million people estimated to be in modern slavery underscores that this isn't just a problem over there.
No, it's deeply connected to the global economy.
To the products we consume every day, as those G20 import figures starkly illustrate, goods like cotton, electronics, fish, potentially tainted.
It highlights that effectively combating this requires understanding its deep historical roots, yes, but also its modern manifestations and those interconnected drivers: poverty, weak governance, business practices, and, yes, consumer demand.
It really demands both historical awareness and ongoing collective action.
Absolutely.
So as we wrap up, maybe something for you, the listener, to consider. How does that ancient persistent demand for cheap labor, the demand that drove systems from Egyptian corvée and Roman latifundia to the brutal transatlantic trade and then morphed into post-abolition forms like sharecropping and indentured servitude, how does that connect to the modern demand for inexpensive goods and services? The demand that fuels exploitation in today's incredibly complex global supply chains.
It's a direct line in many ways.
Yeah. What role does our consumption potentially play, however indirectly, in this long, seemingly unbroken history of exploitation? And how does understanding this whole arc compel us to engage with modern slavery, not just as some historical artifact, but as a present-day challenge requiring our vigilance, our informed choices, and our active support for the ongoing fight for freedom?
A profound question, really. It forces us to confront the contemporary relevance of this ancient wrong and our potential connection to it, whether we realize it or not.